This is Stone Contact Sport, and today we are checking out this GPU. Now this is a XFX 6700. So we're going to do a lightning quick unboxing here of the XFX RX 6700 10 gig. The card is very well packaged. There's a lot of nice foam around the card, and in the box you get the warranty information and some driver information, and that's basically it. And the most important part, of course, the card itself. The card is packaged in a plastic bag, and there's a lot of plastic on the card itself as well, such as on the fan shroud and the backplate. First impressions of the build quality is pretty good. This seems to be a nicely put together card, dual slot cooler, XFX on the I/O plate, and yeah, overall looks pretty good. So this is actually the first XFX GPU that I own since XFX made NVIDIA GPUs, which is quite a while ago. And I bought it because it was on sale for a decent price. So you can now get this GPU for less than 300 USD. And the good thing about the RX 6700 is that it comes with 10 gigs of VRAM. No other card below 300 bucks comes with 10 gigs of VRAM, or more than 8, I think. Not even the Intel cards, if I recall correctly. I think I do. So this is the only GPU that you can get for less than 300 bucks with more than 8 gigs of VRAM. And today we're going to see if it can back that up with some good performance as well. So I tested 9 games for raster performance and 3 games for RT performance, because that's all I had time for. And I tested against a few different models. So I tested this card against the RX 6800 from AMD. That's 2 tiers above this card. I tested it against the RTX 3060, the RX 5700 XT, the RTX 2070 Super, and the RX 6600 XT. I think that covers everything. Yeah, pretty much. So I tested at 3 resolutions, 3440 by 1440, 1440p regular, and 4K. Because 1080p is a bit of a waste on some of the stronger GPUs. So I actually also ran this through the test for the low-end hardware. I have a separate test for low-end GPUs, but we're not going to get into those numbers today. So that's quite a lot of numbers, and we will get to them very soon. But first, let's go over the system specs for the test system. The test system was an AM5 based system with the R5 7600X powering it. That's a 6-core 12-threaded CPU on the latest Zen architecture, and that ran on a B650M PG Riptide motherboard, PCI Express 4.0. This is a 4.0 card, so that shouldn't be an issue. And with 32 gigs of DDR5 memory running at 6200. And of course now AMD and NVIDIA has launched their new GPUs, the 4060 Ti and the RX 7600. And any hope you had of getting 8 gigs, more than 8 gigs of VRAM for less than 300 bucks, they basically squashed it. The 4060 Ti, that's 8 gigs, that's 400 bucks. The 4060 hasn't released yet, but that will also be 8 gigs. That's 4 gigs less than the 3060, amazingly. And the 7600 from AMD, that's 270 bucks, which is pretty close to the price of the RX 6700. And it only has 8 gigs. So why would you choose a 7600 over the 6700? I don't know, but we will compare the performance of this card against the 6600 XT, because we know from reviews that the RX 7600 is about 10% quicker than the 6600 XT. So if this can match that, and it has 2 gigs more VRAM and it comes in about the same price, honestly, I would be very tempted to choose this over the 7600. The RX 7600 has one advantage, and I think that's AV1 encoding. If you're not streaming, it doesn't really matter. And even if you are streaming, I'm not quite sure it would matter even then. And with that said, let's get on to the numbers. So let's dive right in with Cyberpunk 2077, and here the 6700 outperformed the 6600 XT by 7% and the 3060 by 10%. The performance was almost on par with the 2070 Super, still short of 60 frames per second though. If we move to ultra-wide, here it has a 6% advantage over the 6600 XT and 5% ahead of the 3060, which has gained on it. Here performance also fell short of the 2070 Super. Moving on to 4K, and things do not improve for the 6700. At 4K it offers basically the same performance as the 6600 XT, and the 3060 has a considerable 14% lead. Moving on to our next title, Age of Empires 4, and at 1440p the 6700 is able to deliver 100.6 frames per second average, beating out the 6600 XT by 4% and just edging out the 3060. At 3440 by 1440 we're down to 80.7 frames per second average for the 6700, beating the 6600 XT by 6% and again edging out the 3060. At 4K, NVIDIA's advantage disappears and we fall just shy of 60 frames per second with 57 frames per second average for the 6700, which meant it outperformed the 6600 XT by 9%, and the 3060 falls behind here with the 6700 beating it by 17% and almost matching the 2070 Super. Next title is Control. In Control, the RX 6700 is able to deliver 60.8 frames per second average, which is a 7% increase over the 6600 XT, and it's 14% ahead of the 3060 at 1440p. Going ultra-wide, we are down to 46.3 frames per second average, and the performance uplift compared to the 6600 XT and 3060 is almost not even worth mentioning. Performance will feel the same on the 6600 XT, 3060, 5700 XT and 6700. At 4K, the 6700 is able to beat the 3060 by 13%, but both fail to hit 30 frames per second average, so it doesn't really matter. Moving to Elder Scrolls Online, and here the 7600 was able to push out 115.7 frames per second average at 1440p. This made it 15% faster than the 6600 XT and a whopping 25% ahead of the 3060. At 3440 by 1440 we're down to 85.6 frames per second average, still plenty playable, beating out the 6600 XT by 10% and the 3060 by 11%. At 4K we managed to just get over 60 frames per second on average, and that made it 13% faster than the 6600 XT and 11% quicker than the 3060. Next up it's Battlefield 2042, and here we got 88.5 frames per second average at 1440p, which puts it 9% ahead of the 6600 XT and 23% ahead of the 3060. Moving on to ultra-wide, we're down to 68.7 frames per second average, making it 12% faster than the 6600 XT and 19% faster than the 3060. At 4K, we're falling down to 46 frames per second on average, putting it 11% ahead of the 3060 and 17% ahead of the 6600 XT. You can of course use DLSS with the NVIDIA GPUs to gain the upper hand, but when we go by raw performance, the AMD takes the crown in Battlefield 2042, who has yet to implement FSR. Moving on to New World, at 1440p we end up at 79.1 frames per second on average, and that makes it 11% quicker than the 6600 XT and 19% faster than the 3060. At 3440 by 1440 we fall short of 60 frames per second and end up at 55.4 frames per second on average, 5% ahead of the 6600 XT and 7% ahead of the 3060. At 4K we are down to 35.4 frames per second average, and that makes it 8% quicker than the 6600 XT and 5% ahead of the 3060. Next up is ACC. This game prefers NVIDIA GPUs and has some issues with frame pacing or frame times on the RDNA 2 GPUs. The 6700 ends up at 105.3 frames per second on average at 1440p, which makes it 5% quicker than the 6600 XT, but the 3060 has the upper hand and is 7% quicker. At 3440 by 1440 the 6700 hands in 79.8 frames per second on average, and that puts it a mere 4% ahead of the 6600 XT, and the 3060 now has an 11% lead. At 4K the 3060's lead decreases to 4% over the 6700. Finally, for the rest of benchmarks is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and while ACC preferred NVIDIA cards, this game seems to run better on AMD cards. The 6700 delivers good performance here and ends up at 75 frames per second on average. That puts it at a surprising 23% lead over the 6600 XT and almost the same over the 3060. The 3070, while not represented on screen here because of space constraints, is only 11% ahead. At 3440 by 1440 the 6700 falls shy of 60 frames per second at 57, which made it 24% faster than the 6600 XT and 11% ahead of the 3060. At 4K, the 6700's advantage over the 3060 is now down to 5%, but it maintains a steady 23% lead over the 6600 XT. Before we turn to the ray tracing benchmarks, let's take a look at the average FPS over these 9 games. Normalizing for the 6700, we see that it is 9% faster than the 6600 XT on average, and 11% compared to the 3060 at 1440p. At 3440 by 1440, things change a bit. Here the 6700 has only a 6% lead over the 3060 on average, and is 8% faster than the 6600 XT. The 6800 is now 55% quicker though, but it costs over 60% more. At 4K, the 6800 is 58% faster, but the 6700 is now 12% ahead of the 6600 XT, but only 4% quicker than the 3060. So for rest of performance, this card is best at regular 1440p high-ish settings or 1080p with max settings. Performance takes a dive on high resolutions, which is pretty typical of lower-end RDNA 2 GPUs. Now let's take a look at ray tracing performance. I only tested 3 games and we start off with Ghostwire Tokyo. Here the RX 6700 delivers a somewhat playable experience at 1440p with 68 frames per second on average. The frame times are not great, but it's playable. This is with RT Medium and FSR DLSS set to quality. The RX 6700 offers 10% more performance compared to the 6600 XT, but the 3060 is another 15% ahead of the 6700. At 1440p ultra-wide, we're down to 51.3 frames per second on average, 9% quicker than the 6600 XT, but again the 3060 is beating it by about the same delta as before. At 4K, we are barely getting above 30 frames per second, a 13% increase over the 6600 XT, and this time the 3060 is only 7% quicker. None of these cards managed to achieve 60 frames per second though. Next up for ray tracing is Warhammer 40k Darktide. And this game is really tough to run. At 1440p with FSR or DLSS set to balanced, the 6700 is only able to push out 35.9 frames per second average, an increase of 7% over the 6600 XT, but the 3060 is kicking its ass, delivering a whopping 37% more frames per second. At 1440p ultra-wide, we're down to 28.9 frames per second average, keeping the same delta to the 6600 XT, and the 3060 is now 34% quicker, essentially being a tier above the 6700. At 4K, the 6700 is down to 20 frames per second on average, and the 3060 is now a whopping 44% quicker, even though that doesn't really deliver a playable experience either. At 4K, we see the biggest delta to the 6600 XT at 30%, but that's the difference between 15 and 20 frames per second on paper, but the actual experience is terrible in both cases, so it doesn't really matter. Last up is Cyberpunk 2077. Again, we are running DLSS or FSR set to balanced, and at 1440p, that means the 6700 is able to push out 32.7 frames per second on average, at 24% increase over the 6600 XT, but again, we see the 3060 is running away from the 6700 and it's almost matching the 6800. The 3060 was 41% faster than the 6700. At 1440p ultra-wide, the 6700 is down to 25.8 frames per second on average, over twice the performance of the 6600 XT, but again, it doesn't really matter because the game is unplayable at this performance level. The 3060 is 36% faster here, and it is actually faster than the 6700 was at regular 1440p. At 4K, none of the cards are able to achieve above 30 frames per second on average, not represented here, but I can reveal that the 3070 is 2 frames per second faster than the 6800, so even that card struggles at 4K. The 6700 is able to do 15.4 frames per second on average, again quite a bit quicker than the 6600 XT, but the 3060 is 47% faster, although it again doesn't really matter because the game is not really playable at this performance level. In hindsight, I would have preferred to use a mixture of games with heavy RT and lighter RT, but I've sold the 3060, so that will not happen. So when it comes to RT performance, the 3060 wipes the floor with the 6700, and the heavier the RT load, the bigger advantage for the 3060. So let's move on to power consumption, and here things are interesting in my opinion. The only caveat here is that I actually sold the 3060 before I tested the power consumption on that card, so that's not present. I'm sorry. I have included a GTX 1060 3 gig. I guess that makes up for it. And I think I also have the 3070 in the charge. You'll see. But the power consumption on these RX 6700 10 gig is actually pretty good, in my opinion. It's a fairly efficient card. So, if we compare it to the RX 6600 XT, at idle with a single monitor, 1440p monitor, the not the 1070, the 6700 consumed 77 watts. Well, the whole system consumed 77 watts from the wall. That's actually pretty good when you compare it to the rest of the numbers here. It varies a couple of watts here and there. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. The outlier here is the RX 5700 XT that used 110 watts with a single monitor. Well, this whole system used 110 watts. And that's a bit strange, but I think maybe the reason for that is that the RX 5700 XT that I have is the Gigabyte edition, the Aorus edition, with the 6 display outputs, and maybe that causes it to use more power even though a single monitor is connected. I don't really know. But if you compare this to the multi-monitor result, you can see that the RX 5700 XT only used 3 watts more when using 2 monitors, while the other ones went up like 20 to 30 watts. So that's a difference. I used 2 monitors for this test, and it was a 1440p 165 Hz refresh rate monitor, FreeSync supported, and the 3440 by 1440 monitor. That's the multi-screen result. That's both a 1440p regular and ultra wide. And the regular had a 165 Hz refresh rate. The ultra wide had 100 Hz refresh rate. So that may be more difficult for the card compared to 2 equal screens. I don't really know. The result anyway is that the RX 6700 is pretty decent when it comes to power consumption at idle with single or multi-screen. Now for the more interesting part is the TimeSpy Extreme power consumption. So we ran TimeSpy Extreme stress test with a single monitor. I also tried to run it with 2 monitors, and the power consumption didn't really change, so it doesn't really matter. But the RX 6700 used 206, well, the whole system with the RX 6700 used 260 watts from the wall, so it used a bit less than that because we also have efficiency losses in the PSU. But 260 from the wall, that was 5 watts less than the 6600 XT, so this is actually more efficient compared to the 6600 XT. Now, of course, you can bear in mind that the 6600 XT I have is the Gaming X from MSI, so that's probably, the power limit is probably a bit higher on that compared to some of the base models, I guess. Even so, it's a good result, and kind of makes you wonder why XFX chose to go with dual 8 pins for this card, because that seems excessive. The 6600 XT uses a single 8 pin, and the 2 other dual 8-pin cards here are the RX 6800, which ended up at 340 watts, and the 5700 XT at 373 watts. Now, next up is maybe the most important or most interesting part, and that's the noise and temperature part. So this card obviously is pretty big. It has 3 fans, but it's only a dual slot cooler, so it doesn't take up a lot of the other PCI slots on your motherboard, but it is pretty long, so you need to make sure you can fit it in your case. For temperatures, we actually got some pretty good results. At stock, it seems to have a fairly aggressive temperature target, I think, in my opinion anyway. So the GPU temp ended up at 63 degrees Celsius. The junction temp, or the hotspot temp, on the GPU was at 78, so that's 15 degrees higher. That's not too bad. I've had cards that are way worse than that. Memory junction was 60 degrees Celsius. That's very good. So memory temperatures are very good on this card. The cooling on the memory is extremely well done. And the VRM temperatures also ended up at 60 degrees Celsius. Noise ended up at 37.5 dBA. And the fan speed that the card ended up at was about 1300 RPM. That's pretty good. It was very silent. 37.5 dBA is one of the better results I've ever measured, actually. And when you look at the temperatures, with a GPU temp of 63 degrees, you could probably ramp the fans down to 1000 RPM and make it really silent while still being well within the safe limits in terms of temperatures. But yeah, almost 60 degrees when running, that's very good. And yeah, you can, if you have a case with very bad airflow, or if you overclock the card, the fan speeds will ramp up to about 1500 RPMs, and at that point it will make a bit more noise and temperatures will be a bit higher, but I mean, you don't really need to do it, and if you do it, you can still take control of the fans and ramp them down manually, so you don't need to listen to the fan noise, although it's not really fan noise because the noise is very low even if you overclock it. So yeah, I think the XFX, so to wrap things up, I know I've been a bit all over the place right now, but let's wrap this up. So the XFX RX 6700, it performs about 10% quicker than the 6600 XT at 1440p. But yeah, actually top notch, 2 thumbs up on this GPU. Very good performance, price also very good. And if you consider buying a GPU below 300 USD, I think this should be your top pick. Of course, now you have also the RX 7600. We have seen reviews of those cards, but efficiency is not particularly impressive. I don't know how it compares to this card, but I wouldn't imagine it being much better. Performance compared to the 6600 XT is about 10% faster, so performance is on par with the 6700 non-XT. And it has 8 gigs of VRAM. This has 10 gigs of VRAM. If I was deciding to buy a GPU below $300, it would be the RX 6700. So the thing about using a long time to edit a video is that things change. So right now you can actually get a 3060 for the same price as this particular card, 280 USD. In addition to that, the RX 6600 XT is now down to 230. So I made a average FPS per dollar chart, and in this chart I've actually included the ray tracing benchmark. So this is average performance over all the gaming benchmarks, raster and ray tracing. So keep that in mind. So if you compare the value of the 6600 XT, the 360 and the 6700 right now, you have to pay 3.46 USD per FPS for the 6600 XT. So that is actually the best value. This non-XT version might even be better value, but I don't have one of those. Then there is the RX 6700 10 gig. That's 3.8 USD per average FPS, and then there's the RTX 3060, which is $4 per average FPS. So even though the 3060 technically is worse value, you do get a couple of extra features. So you do get DLSS, which is a superior upscaling technology, and you do get 2 gigabytes of extra VRAM. So personally, for the same price, I would probably go with the 3060, even though the 6700 is on average like 12% faster in raster performance. The RTX 3060 is on average over 20% faster in ray tracing performance. So it does make a bit up in ray tracing, and you do get 2 gigs extra VRAM. So I mean, the 3060 might actually be the best value, or sort of one of the better cards of the NVIDIA lineup. Even when you compare to the newer 4060, which we haven't seen reviews of yet, but that will only have 8 gigs. So yeah, for the same price, I would go for the 3060. If the 6700 is cheaper, go with that. I mean, if it's like $10 or $20 cheaper, then yeah, consider these 6700. But the 3060 might actually be the best deal right now for less than 300 USD. So I just wanted to correct myself in saying that. And that's it for this video. We'll just end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.